A couple weeks ago in Weird Yu-Gi-Oh! Card Effects Episode 8, I talked about many level 4 and lower monsters with high attack points that were released in the early years of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. And these monsters were very interesting because they were competing against a lot of normal monsters with 17, 18, and 1900 attack points, and these cards oftentimes had about 2000 or higher attack with a pretty big drawback. And we spent that video talking about their drawbacks, and I learned that cards like Flash Assailant were pretty good in Duel Links back when that game was first released, and also I learned that a lot of people think that Flash Assailant plus Reverse Trap was a good combo back in the day in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Anyway, today's video is going to be a sort of sequel to episode 8 in this series. We are once again talking about level 4 and lower monsters that had high attack points in the early years of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and we're going to talk about if their drawbacks were too harsh. On the off chance that you didn't watch that previous episode, make sure to go do so after watching this one, because I think between the two videos I've basically covered every single level 4 or lower monster with a lot of attack points in the first like 5 years of Yu-Gi-Oh! Once again, these cards are in order of release, so we have Nuvi the Wicked, which was released in 2003 in Labyrinth of Nightmare, and this was a card that I probably should have included on that first video, but as I sort of mentioned in that discussion, it was getting really long, and I wanted to make sure the video actually got out on time, so this is like the bonus cards that didn't make it into that original episode. This is a level 4 Dark Attribute Fiend monster with 2000 attack and 800 defense. If this monster is normal summoned, you destroy this card. If your opponent controls any monster, decrease the attack of this card by 200 points for each monster on your opponent's side of the field. So here's the thing with this card, it sounds very similar to Boar Soldier. You could special summon it, or you could set it face down and flip summon it on a later turn, but for every single monster your opponent has, it loses 200 attack. That is a pretty big issue, because pretty much if your opponent has at least one monster on the board, then this card is really bad. At that point, you might as well have just used a 7-colored fish, which has 1800 attack. So you would somehow have to find a way to get this thing on the board, either by setting it and then flip summoning it, or perhaps by special summoning it, and then you would have to find a way to make sure your opponent has no monsters. Nuvi the Wicked is basically Boar Soldier 2.0. It has the same normal summoning restriction where it blows up if you normal summon it, but the attack reduction isn't as bad. Still, even by old school standards, this card is pretty useless. While I did spend some time in the last video talking about Goblin Attack Force and Goblin Elite Attack Force, I did not talk about Spear Dragon, which was released in Legacy of Darkness in 2003. So this is basically a smaller version of the Goblin Attack Force cards, but it does have a slight benefit. So this is a Wind Dragon level 4 with 1900 attack points, so maybe not anything too crazy compared to a lot of the other cards we looked at in this series, but this thing says, if this card attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage. If this card attacks, it is changed to defense position at the end of the damage step. So there are a couple benefits here. First off, Spear Dragon can switch back to attack mode a lot earlier than the Goblin Attack Force cards, because those ones cannot change their battle position until your next turn's end phase, which is quite a while. With Spear Dragon though, if it survived the next turn, you could switch it back to attack mode no problem. Also, that piercing damage is pretty cool. Maybe it's not super relevant, but it is a bonus ability. However, I'm not sure if Spear Dragon's bonus abilities were worth it, because after it attacks, it goes to defense mode, and now it has 0 defense, and pretty much anything can run it over. For a lot of players, if they really wanted to play a glass cannon type card in their deck, they were probably just going to play Goblin Attack Force. Arsenal Bug was released in July of 2003, and it's an Earth level 3 insect monster with 2000 attack and 2000 defense. I will mention here real quick as my obligatory shout out to Battle Pack 3 that Arsenal Bug is very good in that format. As far as the actual TCG goes, well, let's take a look at what it does. If you control no other insect type monsters, this card's attack and defense become 1000. So even nowadays in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, there are not that many good insect archetypes, but especially back in 2003, there were just not very many insect monsters, and many of the ones that were in the game were not very good. Unfortunately, Arsenal Bug really had no place to shine back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh, despite the fact that I personally feel this card is pretty well designed. I know that might seem like a surprise because it didn't see any play, but I think if it would have been pretty much any other type, even some of the other underutilized ones, I think it could have been a lot better. It just comes down to there weren't a lot of good insect decks back in 2003, so there was no place for Arsenal Bug to fit. However, if it would have been another type, maybe it would have seen some competitive use, because the downside isn't really that bad if there are good monsters of that type. In October of 2003, in Magician's Force, we got Armor X, I think it's pronounced, and this is probably one of the most highly requested cards on that last video. I do not know how I missed this one. I definitely would have included it. This is a level 4 light rock monster, which is kind of random. I thought it would be a spellcaster, and it has 2400 attack points and 1400 defense. That is a lot of stats on a level 4 monster. This card cannot attack in the same turn it is normal summoned, flip summoned, or special summoned, which is obviously a pretty big downside. During each of your and your opponent's standby phases, remove one spell counter on your side of the field if you do not destroy this card. Holy cow, is that a really bad set of restrictions. Maybe if you could attack with this card during the turn that you normal summoned it, it could have been okay as a way to do 2400 damage to the opponent, but because you can't attack with this card, and because there were so few decks that actually could reliably put spell counters on the board back in the day, this card looks pretty much useless, and that's how it was even in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! A few years later, in 2006, we would receive a spell counter structure deck, Spellcaster's Judgment, and that did have a lot of ways to use spell counters, but even if you were playing a deck based on that structure deck, this thing is just really bad and difficult to use. Also in Magician's Force, we had Giant Orc, which was basically the budget version of Goblin Attack Force. It might not seem like it nowadays, but Goblin Attack Force was pretty hard to come by at this point. Its original printing was ultra rare, and a year after Giant Orc it would get a super rare reprint, and we wouldn't see a common Goblin Attack Force reprint until 2005. But this card was a common, so it was pretty easy to get. It has 100 less attack, and obviously it has 0 defense, but other than that it's pretty much just Goblin Attack Force. Giant Orc is a level 4 Dark Fiend monster with 2200 attack points and 0 defense, and it says if this card attacks, it is changed to defense position at the end of the battle phase. You cannot change this battle position until the end of your next turn. So the exact same restriction as the original Goblin Attack Force, but the stats are a little bit worse, and I would say on average being a Dark Fiend is probably worse than being an Earth Warrior, because you had a lot of warrior support back in the day. However, Giant Orc was a pretty good budget alternative to Goblin Attack Force for a little while, and I think it does deserve a shout out in this sequel video. In 2005, in Cybernetic Revolution, we obviously had Cyber Dragon, which invalidates a lot of these cards, but in Cybernetic Revolution we actually had a couple more of these strong level 4 monsters. So Giant Kozaki is a dark level 4 fiend monster with 2500 attack points and 2400 defense. Obviously those are huge numbers. What is the drawback? If there is no face-up Kozaki on the field, destroy this card. If this face-up card is destroyed, inflict damage equal to the original attack of this card to its current controller. Kozaki, by the way, is a level 1 vanilla monster, so it's completely useless. While there have been some sort of theorized combos with this card where you make the opponent take the damage, overall those combos were way too gimmicky to ever see success back in the day, and trying to use this card with the intended combo of having Kozaki on the field to make sure you have this big monster was really bad. Giant Kozaki is hilarious, it has a lot of stats, but it's a pretty bad card in pretty much every single situation. Finally, we have Indomitable Fighter Lee, also in Cybernetic Revolution. This is pretty much just another version of Goblin Attack Force. It does have a really cool story behind it that you can look up if you want to, but other than that, the card itself does not really have any significant advantages over the original Goblin Attack Force. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure if you haven't seen it already to check check out episode 8 of the Weird Card Effects series, because pretty much all the cards that I didn't mention in today's video were already mentioned in that previous episode. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.